in my estimation, they are qualitatively different. What Hamas is publicly what it's doing is genocide. What Israel's doing is not genocide.
There's a difference between what Israel, you could say both Israel and Hamas have engaged in genocidal and murderous rhetoric.
No.
And I'll give you an example. Yes, they have.
No, you can't.
Benjamin Netanyahu. I can. Is it uncensored or not?
Yes. You can say
Let me quote what the Israeli authorities have said.
Go on.
Benjamin Netanyahu, when he quoted Amalek, the scriptures, what does Amalek say? He quotes Amalek when they attacked the Israelites. And what God told the Israelites to do was to kill every man, woman, child, and livestock. If I would put it to you, an Islamist leader was quoting a similarly genocidal passage from the Quran, you would not, I would say, hesitate.
Can I respond?
We haven't. But you've had a lot.
Respond to that
I'm
point.
going to respond just quickly. Israeli officials said that Gaza will end up being a city of tents with no building standing. That they are attacking for damage, not for accuracy. The agricultural minister, Avi Dikti, he said we are rolling out a new Nakba. A Nakba is the mass expulsion, 700,000 Palestinians in 1948. This is why hundreds of genocide scholars, people who are actually, unlike you and I, experts in the field of genocide studies, fear that a genocide is taking place. So the difference between Israel and Hamas is Hamas does not have the capacity to wipe out Israel. Israel is wiping Gaza off the map.
Israel could, if they wanted to, kill everyone in Gaza. They decided not to do that.
Is your definition,
genocide is where you want to kill everyone.
Sorry. Your definition of genocide, because in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin hasn't killed every last Ukrainian. That's simply not happened. No, he hasn't. And nor has he stated his intention to do so, and nor as brutal and barbaric.
Vladimir Putin, absolutely, by illegally invading a sovereign country and indiscriminately bombing anything in front of him.
Indiscriminately bombing?
Is waging a form of genocide.
Wow. Indiscriminate bombing. Gaza, more than 2 Hiroshima bombs worth have been dropped on East London in the space of 5 weeks.
OK, let me ask you two questions.
No, you said Ukraine. No, I'm going to have to put this to you.
OK.
15,000 people have now been killed now by the Israelis, estimate, in Gaza. 1 in every 200 people in Gaza have now been killed. If you were to adjust for population in Ukraine, that would be 300,000 Ukrainian civilians. 300,000, there's been a terrible death toll. It's estimated by the UN 10,000 civilians have been killed since February last year. In the space of 5 weeks, a country with a much, much smaller population has had a death toll higher officially than that in Ukraine. So can it be that you call that genocide, but when you have nearly half the entire civilian death toll of the Bosnian War in a country which is twice the size in terms of population, why isn't that genocide bit?
So there's a lot to say about that. Okay, let's take it piece by piece over here, right? First, in terms of the Ukrainian war, the genocide was Bucha and Irpin. Those are the genocides that Russia committed, right? Not everything Russia's done in the war is genocide. The war is immoral, the war is illegal, the war, it's just to grab land and so on. But not everything going on has been genocide. A lot of the countryside fighting has been a proper military battle, however immoral it was of him to invade. The genocide was Bucha and Irpin. Small numbers, but when Russians took people handcuffed to a defenseless and shot them like Hamas did in Israel, that's a very clear genocide. The reason the civilian casualty rate is so low, by the way, is largely because Ukraine actually evacuated its civilians from the danger zone, just like Israel's evacuated hundreds of thousands of Israelis from the areas around Gaza and Lebanon. And normal countries do that. Only Hamas and ISIS and people put them as human shields. But let's get to the more important point, because I think his argument is that, yes, Piers, you're right, Israel hasn't unleashed its full power on the Palestinian population, but it's very clear they have genocidal intent, because Bibi Netanyahu quoted a passage Amalek, and then he went on to say that means to kill men, women, and children. Actually sounded, I think if we listen to again, I suspect it won't be this, but it sounded like he's saying that Netanyahu himself said that Israel has to kill men, women, and children, right? And he said, had a Muslim scholar got up and quoted the Quran saying that, you'd all be going crazy. I assume the speech is referring to, because this one that's always been quoted, is the one on the 28th of October. And in that speech, Netanyahu invoked Amalek. Now, you know, and I know, and I think anyone watching your channel, I think you've done a whole bunch of videos. I think you actually did one with me a few years ago when you asked about what Amalek means. People sometimes say Hitler's Amalek and the Nazis were Amalek. So there is a biblical nation called Amalek in the biblical text that's seen as the most horrifically evil, committed to the total genocide of the Jews, and in which the biblical command is to destroy them. How that's interpreted, there's definitely interpretations that included wiping out the entire tribe in a total war. However, Nobody thinks there is a physical genetic Amalek or any version of that nowadays. And nobody's thought that for thousands of years. And when somebody says Hitler's Amalek, they do not mean that we can go and wipe out every German. Even in the middle of World War II, when somebody said the Nazis are Amalek, they mean they are the most evil, they're out there to genocidally kill us. That's the label that is used. Nobody thinks that means that you can even go and kill German civilians, right? Absolutely nobody would have thought that. During World War II, I'm saying, right? Nobody would have interpreted that way. That's ridiculous. And when Netanyahu said in that same speech where he said we're fighting an evil like Amalek, he's referring to people who came across the border and literally beheaded babies.
Yeah, Hamas,
such a horrific, Hamas have to have such a horrific cruelty. He's saying they are Amalek. We have to remember the biblical injunction, remember Amalek, which people nowadays means remember that when evil stands up to kill you, don't be timid in its face. Don't be scared of the horrificness of them, and don't be merciful on them. You have to eliminate them because they're going to come and kill you all. That doesn't mean killing civilians. 2 paragraphs later in the same speech, and it's online, you can find that speech. Everybody can see that speech. Netanyahu spoke about the Israeli army being the most moral in the world. And he said specifically because it will never target civilians. Now, you could perhaps think that secretly Israel's really instructed its army to do something different. I mean, the army would be doing really be a hopeless army because it has the capability of destroying the whole of Gaza in a matter of hours if it wanted to. It's clearly not trying to kill the civilians of Gaza. It evacuated 1 million civilians out of Gaza City when it was going to send its ground troops in, despite Hamas trying to keep those millions in as human shields. It doesn't look anything remotely like a genocide. Yes, there is tragic numbers of civilian deaths. You know, the West, Britain and America had the same problem when it went after ISIS in Iraq. There were thousands of civilian deaths. I don't think anybody thinks it was a genocide or an attempt at anything other than the moral attempt to destroy ISIS and the tragedy of how you try to do that when there's so many human shields around. But the point is, you cannot say that Netanyahu's speech meant that Israelis are meant to wipe out men, women, and children when he explicitly said that's not it. He explicitly said we are not going to attack the civilians. Right? And then he criticized Hamas for leaving them with human shields and what a horrific crime they're committing against the Palestinian people. He said that. You know, he quoted so many speeches like that. All the ones he's talking about where people in positions of power were making those speeches, they very clearly said it. I don't know if he quoted other people, quote Herzog, when Herzog got annoyed and said they voted in Hamas. And then a journalist asked him in the same speech and said, 1 second, you're saying Israel isn't targeting civilians, but now you're saying that they voted in Hamas and they were responsible. And he said, no, what I mean is if you allow a rocket in your home to fire from, you can't complain if someone hits your home. But of course, I'm not saying we can go after civilians. And yet that snippet's quoted. I think a line I heard him quote was something about we're going for destruction or accuracy or something. That's Hagari, was the army spokesman. Somebody asked him at the beginning whether Israel's using the knock on the door tactic. In previous rounds of fighting, what Israel did is if it was about to hit a Hamas bunker, it physically phone called the civilians above and said, by the way, can all of you leave in 1 hour's time? We're going to hit this. And because some civilians still didn't leave or refused to leave, or Hamas told them not to leave, they actually did what's called, like, made a loud explosive sound on the roof called the knock on the door. So they all then panicked and left. And only after they left did Israel then hit the bunker. Now, in previous rounds of fighting, Israel was doing everything possible to get the civilian casualty rate to be as close to zero as possible, even if it meant not destroying Hamas. They were willing to pay the price of not destroying Hamas, hitting its infrastructure, destroying some of its underground bunkers, destroying some of its weapons munition facilities, its underground rocket launchers, which would hurt Hamas. But there was no attempt to destroy Hamas, because every time you warn the civilian, obviously Hamas in the bunker below, somebody's telling them, by the way, Israel's about to hit you, remove all your main weaponry and anything you need and all your fighters, get out of there. So that's what it meant. We're not going for that anymore. Now we have a war to destroy Hamas. We actually have to catch the Hamas in the bunkers. But of course they're going to do the maximum to, within that constraint, minimize civilian losses, right? Of course, but that's what they're all saying. So then to go and say, no, you take those quotes. Now, again, I think we should assume good faith. I think we should assume in all probability that Owen Jones actually believes that Israel has, very, very genocidal intent or such a low view of Palestinians that he really believes Israeli leaders could just wake up and say, hey, let's do this, right? And so then he interprets those quotes and they seem to fit that narrative very well. And you'll find lots of people around the world who think that Israel really, really is like that will probably believe it. But if you look at the quotes yourself, just look at the context and look at the speeches, I don't think there's any possible way to interpret any of the speeches. And by the way, there's been hundreds, if not thousands of speeches by decision makers. whether it's the 6 people in the war cabinet and the heads of the military, whether it's military spokesmen. They must have been interviewed so many times on all TV stations all over. You can literally see thousands of interviews probably of these decision makers, and they're all 100% consistent, running all the way through. We are not targeting civilians, right? You can't find a speech where they didn't say that. Even when Netanyahu explicitly evoked Amalek as the evil of what Hamas is, he then 2 paragraphs later makes it so clear we are not going for the civilians. And Israel's actions back that up. Right? The actions are very, very clear.
Yeah.
Right? Russia and Bucha and Irpin went out to kill every civilian. You have not found Israelis walking in when they did find civilians in Gaza, butchering them, beheading them. God forbid. They went into the hospital with equipment, with medical equipment. They had human evacuation convoys. Right? They've been doing everything they can to keep as many Palestinian civilians alive in what is such a cruel and horrific war. For 16 years, Israel avoided this war, despite the fact what it meant for their civilians being rocketed every so often, because they didn't want Palestinian civilian casualties. After October the 7th, there's no choice. The only way to save millions of Israelis from future attacks like this, or much, much worse, is to destroy Hamas. That's it. But to link that to genocide, anyway.
And the great irony is that Hamas is the very thing that he's accusing Israel of. Hamas wants to wipe out every single Jewish man, woman, and child, and they certainly invoke religious texts to do so.
Well, look, let's Iron Man and not straw man here. I think from what I saw in that clip, he was very clear that he would say Hamas is genocidal. He just wants to also put. There are some who deny Hamas genocide.
Owen Jones.
Owen Jones. I heard him say Hamas and.
I think from what I've seen, there's lots of evidence that Owen Jones is a Hamas apologist.
Okay.
Yeah.
You've probably seen a lot more of him than I have. From what I've seen of him, and I haven't seen as much as you, and from that particular clip, I wouldn't draw that conclusion. So if you want me to comment, to me,
it was recently discovered that I think during his student years, he was editing articles about Hamas to make them seem less genocidal and toxic and hateful than they were. And he also, I couldn't believe it. I was astounded to see that he tweeted a few weeks ago that the anti-homosexual policies in Gaza were really introduced by the British mandates and had nothing to do with Hamas. Okay. I mean, it's.
Okay, I only want to comment on what I'm seeing. I want to be as fair as I can to people. I'm obviously very emotional about it. You are, they are. Lots of people have lots of emotions in this. From what I saw in that, I wouldn't necessarily blame somebody from the student past. Okay, but I don't know. I can't pass any judgment. What I'm saying is within that, I felt he probably has seen those. I'm guessing he might not have seen them in the full context. He's heard other people say them. He builds a narrative that makes sense to him. I'm just saying when you actually look at the source material in its context and look, you and I have the advantage of knowing hundreds of Israelis. I'm guessing you do. I certainly do, right? And I know people from all parts of the political spectrum. Again, you probably do as well. I know people who vote very right wing. I know people who vote very left wing. I know people, and one thing I know, I think, like I say, it must be well over 95% of them, with even the ones who are bluster and we shall flatten Gaza. And when you actually say to them, what's your ideal number of civilians killed? Every one of them says 0.
Yeah.
Right. That is the prevailing view. That is the view, I think, of all the leadership and all the military, everyone. Yeah. And that, but because we know that, when we hear that quote, it's like, well, let's look up the source properly. Oh, yeah, that's consistent. Okay, I could also say Hamas is Amalek. I would say, it happens to be, I might say, I could also say Hamas is as evil as Amalek, what the fighters did over there. I could also say beheading children is Amalek. I would never mean killing women and children, God forbid. And Bibi Netanyahu made it 100% clear that's not what he meant.